Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my speed talk. As you know, my topic for today is a comparative visual content analysis of the CDC and WHO COVID-19 infographics, and I recently wrote and defended my thesis on this particular topic. So for today's presentation, I wanted to begin with my research questions. The first question that I was interested in answering was what kinds of information were delivered through the CDC and WHO infographics. And I was particularly interested in this question because infographics as a genre is a pretty short document that is expected to deliver a lot of information. So I wanted to see what kinds of topics were covered given the limited space afforded by infographics. So from my analysis, I discovered that the infographics mainly conveyed 5 types of information. They covered how-to information, they covered the do's and don'ts of doing something, they covered step-by-step guidelines that explained certain procedures, they also covered checklists which were more typical in the CDC infographics, and lastly, they covered some general informational topics that just aimed at educating people. The next research question that I was focused on was how the text and graphics were organized. So the overall major finding here was that the CDC infographics were more structured, whereas the WHO infographics were more non-structured, or what I call abstract. The next and last research question for my study was what rhetorical strategies were implemented by the CDC and WHO in their COVID-19 infographics. And this portion of my research questions will be covered throughout this presentation as we move forward. So in my study, the most important step for me was to identify the gap that it would fulfill. So far there has been research done that defines infographics, that situates infographics in certain disciplines, including technical communication. But there's a lack of research done on how knowledge construction takes place in these infographics, and what are some features of the health and risk communication that is transmitted through infographics. So the goal of my study was to address, at least in part, this gap in the existing research on how health and risk communication messages are designed and delivered using infographics. So I also wanted to quickly focus on the data collection process for my study. I randomly selected 55 infographics from the CDC and WHO websites, and the selection was based on Toad's definition of infographics. So the specific criteria that I was looking for was that these infographics must attempt to educate the audience about something specific, and that they should be using a combination of words and visuals. I also used the general inductive coding approach as outlined by Thomas to sort my data, and I ended up with multiple codes and categories that basically formed the scaffolding of my analysis. So in my analysis, a major aspect that I covered is why managing public actions is so important, especially in risk situations. So with every risk situation comes the need for official communication channels that provide accurate and timely information to the public. As Dr. Ding has highlighted in her work, the lack of official sources of information, especially during a pandemic, makes the public resort to misinformation, which ultimately leads to panic-induced behaviors like we see here, panic buying in times of COVID. So in risk communication, when accurate information is delivered to the public, it basically allows the public to make more informed decisions without panicking. And I argue that using infographics for such communication not only provides sufficient information to the public, but also does so in an engaging manner. So through my analysis, I discovered that there were 4 rhetorical strategies that were common to both the CDC and WHO, and I will go through each of these in detail. So the first one is communicating risk by referring to the virus, and this strategy basically signifies the characterization of coronavirus in textual and or visual terms. So textually, these infographics make direct references to COVID by using phrases like, coronavirus or COVID-19. And visually, these infographics represent the virus by showing icons or images of the coronavirus, as you can see here in this image. So in my analysis, I argue that both organizations include limited references to the virus, which is a good thing because when information sounds threatening or scary, it can overwhelm people emotionally because they would start feeling a lack of control over the situation. And the CDC and WHO are limiting themselves to only certain kinds of virus indications that suggest the risk severity but do not scare people off. So there's a balance between this fearsome information and the information that provides preventative measures and solutions. The second strategy that was common to both organizations is that of initiating action, which basically signifies the act of persuasion, something that motivates the audience to undertake specific actions in order to stay safe. So in communication pertaining to COVID, it is very important that information is not just given to the public, but it should be given in a way that it stimulates the audience to follow the advice. And the CDC and WHO both have consistently used a style of communication which is informative, which is authoritative and directive. So the CDC basically initiates action to a greater extent than the WHO, because it more clearly outlines specific details and actions, and therefore it is more likely to actually end up mitigating risk and panic among people. The third common aspect was that of showing more beneficial than detrimental interaction. So beneficial and detrimental interaction were codes in my study that referred to visuals that showed either a positive or a negative interaction between humans or between humans and objects. So an example of beneficial interaction is shown right here, washing your hands and wearing a mask. And that of detrimental interaction is shown right here, like sneezing without covering your face, covering your mouth. So there's a reason for showing both of these interactions, because beneficial interactions tell us what should be done and detrimental interactions tell us what should be avoided. So beneficial interaction basically helps us foster positive behaviors, whereas detrimental interactions create mental models that show how virus contamination occurs. Now, both organizations include lesser detrimental interactions, but they don't completely do away with them because they want to tell the public that, okay, these are certain good practices, but these are some things that you should definitely avoid. And since all of these depictions, like the beneficial and detrimental interactions, they take place in the form of visuals, and since visuals have an emotional impact on people that affects retention of information, including more beneficial depictions than harmful ones, creates a stronger connection with positive actions, which the audience is more likely to remember and eventually follow. The last common aspect is that of graphic representations of symptoms. And by graphic representations, I mean those actions that are reflex responses. So basically sneezing and coughing and getting a fever. So visually representing these symptoms clarifies the content of the infographic and makes it accessible to most people. And the ultimate goal of all of these strategies is to manage public actions. So by providing all of these visual representations and textual persuasion, basically the CDC and WHO are ensuring that the people have everything they need to know about dealing with the situation. So along with the similarities, there were also some differences in how the CDC and WHO implemented these rhetorical strategies. And the most prominent difference, and the only point that I'm going to cover today, is the difference in document design. So basically, as I mentioned before, the CDC infographics are more structured and the WHO infographics are more abstract. A structured document has a flow of information that guides the reader in navigating the document. So if you look at the CDC infographic, you have a title, you have some introductory text right here, and then you have all these numbers. So this is the reading pattern that you will follow. But if you look at the WHO infographic, you might either see the title first or this image first because it takes up a lot of space. So here you have the freedom to start anywhere. All in all, structured document designs basically follow an organizational pattern, and abstract document designs do not have this flow or directionality. So these documents do not intend for the readers to follow a certain reading pattern. Rather, they just provide all the information needed to the public. Both designs have their own benefits. Structured designs are more memorable, as described by Centel, and abstract or non-structured designs give more control to the reader. So the WHO has a wider range of audiences to deliver communication to because it is operating internationally, and therefore this abstract design just makes more sense because it does not really designate a reading pattern. And along with this, other differences included, how numerical information was presented and how some visuals were contextualized. And all of these differences in rhetorical strategies basically led me to the major connecting thread, which is that of national versus international audiences. So this may seem like an obvious statement, but there's a lot of responsibilities that come with the target audience. And I argue that both organizations are audience focused, but both of them have unique approaches to preparing information for their audiences. So while the CDC segregates information based on factors like age, occupation, and the environment in which people will be, and therefore they have separate infographics for children, for athletes, for campers. But on the other hand, the WHO focuses more on providing information on trivial but integral topics, which the audience needs. So there are so many topics that include information like how to wash fruits and vegetables, or how to do laundry, how to exchange currency, how to cope with stress. So similarly, a difference in audience also affects the way that the CDC and WHO organize information. So the CDC follows design principles consistently and hence has more structured approach to organizing information within the infographic. But on the other hand, the WHO creates its infographics for a worldwide audience and has a more abstract text-to-visual arrangement. And this is because people who are accessing WHO infographics in English do not necessarily follow the same reading pattern, that is from left to right. They might be from geographical areas that have different directionality when it comes to reading. So therefore, an abstract design just makes more sense because it gives more authority to the readers and they're free to follow the reading pattern that they would like. And lastly, I wanted to cover the implications of my study. But before I dive into that, I think it's really important to know that COVID is a new scenario which is widespread and it calls for local and international communication strategies. So this particular scenario was not controlled immediately. In fact, it is still around us, and so I cannot really establish any best practices based on my content analysis. In order to establish best practices, I would need further research, which includes surveys and interviews, which would actually help us understand whether these rhetorical strategies have an impact on people's engagement, comprehension, and retention of information. So my contribution via this study is that it is a step taken in the direction of fulfilling the gap in the research that I identified at the beginning of this presentation. So through this particular study, I'm analyzing how knowledge is constructed and what strategies are included in this knowledge construction process. So this study basically lays a groundwork for future evaluations pertaining to the effectiveness of these infographics. And last but not least, I just wanted to quickly put forth the main takeaways of my study. So overall, the CDC takes a more prescriptive approach because of the strategies that it is using, and the WHO gives more agency to the reader. And then to state again, audience is the key factor that stems the difference in the implementation of rhetorical strategies in these infographics. Thank you for hearing me out, and I apologize for not being live on this session, but please feel free to send questions. Here's my email ID. It's mkpwh3@mst.edu. And thank you very much again for hearing me out.